Hey everybody, so it's been a bit over a year since I bought my 2017 Maserati Ghibli S Q4, and I thought it would be a great idea to run over the entire cost of ownership this past year. So taking a look at my bank statements and going over the car payments, insurance, maintenance, and fuel costs of the past year. A lot of people seem to think that these are pretty costly cars, and they're worried about things like maintenance costs, but the point of this video is to be as transparent as possible about the costs and my experience thus far. You know, what do I like about the car? What can you expect? And ultimately, is the cost worth it? I'd like to start out first by just talking about what I like about the car. So, I still think the car is very visually appealing, especially if you get a really nice spec on the car. I have this nice blue, and I think this is a very standout color for Maserati. You typically see a lot of darker colors. I think overall the car has some very nice lines. I actually really like this line that runs along the bottom of the car, and then there's this other one that kind of runs a little bit below the C-pillar and it runs to the tail light. It looks really nice from the side profile. There's also some really nice lines on the front of the car as well. And in this particular model, we have the older version of the Trident on the grille, which I find to be significantly better looking than the newer versions, which, although they're made to be useful and leverage technology with like driver assist, they're just ugly and they look really cheap in comparison. But that's my opinion. There's also, in my opinion, no doubt that the exhaust note is one of the best out there, even stock. Start of this car is pretty loud. And if you put this car in sport mode and really let it rev up, it gets really loud. But the thing is, the car can also be quiet too. If you put it in normal mode, it can be a pretty tame car. It'll still be, louder than most cars, but it'll be relatively quiet. And in this particular model, you're going to get a Ferrari assembled twin turbo V6 that makes a bit over 400 horsepower. I believe it's around 404. The 0 to 60 time is a shade under 5 seconds, I think 4.7. And it's definitely not the fastest thing around, but it definitely feels quite fast when you put your foot down, especially for a luxury sedan. You're certainly not expecting it. And I've talked about this before too. The attention you get in this car is also, pretty astounding for the price point. Plenty of people starting conversations, giving you thumbs up. If you're driving around with your windows down, it's almost like an open invitation to have people start conversations with you at a red light. So if you don't want that to happen, you should probably drive with your windows up. Now, there's still some things I don't like about the car, of course. There's certain components in the interior that are relatively cheap to me. There's like some aluminum on the center console is starting to peel off. That same kind of material is also found on the wheel, and that's looking a little rough, like that's starting to peel as well. That's really my biggest gripe on the interior. Personally, I don't care that there's components that are reused from cheaper cars. That doesn't really bother me. They work. Something else to note, and I don't know if I talked about it before, but the ride quality isn't the best considering it is supposed to be a luxury car, right? The sportier suspension means you're going to feel more of the road, and while it's certainly not as rough as, say, a sports car, it's certainly not as smooth as, say, something from Mercedes-Benz Benz or Cadillac. But I mean, that being said, I can still drive this car for hours with no problems at all. So while it's certainly not a deal breaker for me, if you're expecting, the ride quality of like a Mercedes, you're probably not going to get that here. And I mean, if you are looking for a strictly luxury sedan, there are plenty of better options out there than Maserati. As a matter of fact, if you're looking strictly for that, I wouldn't even recommend Maserati. You could go Mercedes-Benz, you could go Cadillac, you could go Audi. I mean, you could even pay a little bit more or find a used Bentley even in like the same price point. And as far as luxury goes, those are gonna be better cars. But I mean, I hope the reason you go Maserati isn't for it being a luxury sedan. I don't think that's the reason most people choose Maserati. So just know that getting into it. So let's go to the cost of ownership, and ultimately, is that cost worth it? So this was a lot of fun. I went through my bank statements for the entire year, and I kind of looked at my cost on gas, insurance, car payments, added it all up. So I'm going to give the month breakdown here. As you can see here, the car payment was pretty consistent throughout at about $594.74. And there was one instance in July where it was a double payment, but it's ended up skipping the next month. Insurance started out pretty high at around $321.77, but that started to taper down as the months went by. I had an issue with my bank account in December, so I wasn't able to make a payment, which is why you see a larger payment in January of 2022 as well. And I mean, as you can see, the gas fluctuates. It really depends on how often I fill it up, how much I drive the car. Usually these larger gas prices here are reflective of the gas prices increasing and me driving the car more. So keep in mind too, I don't actually commute into an office. I work remote. So if I did commute and I drove my car more, you could expect these prices, or rather the costs here on gas, to double or even triple. So I mean, those could go as high as $600, $700 a month, which isn't insignificant. Now over this year too, I did get an oil and filter change, and that came out to about $583.50. The reason it was so expensive was there was a parts shortage at the time. But I mean, if you get that done at the Maserati dealership, it's usually about $600 anyhow. I actually had that oil change done at a shop near me, so it wasn't at the Maserati dealership. So there were some other costs associated with this car. For example, to get it registered in my state, since I bought it out of state, it cost about $2,279.15, I believe is the exact figure. I'm not including that in this price because the dealership actually paid for that. But the total car payments come out to $7,136.88. The total insurance payments come out to $3,076.07. The total gas cost is $1,477.87. The total maintenance, $583.50. I'm going to throw car washes in here too because I tracked those down, so that came out to about $63. And I ended up putting $7,000 down on this car. So I'll give you kind of both costs. The cost with the money down, which I think should be factored into this first year, and how much it costs, just to own it for a year. Assuming, everything kind of goes as it did here, where, overall the car has been, pretty reliable, and I'm very thankful for that. So we're looking at a 1 year total cost of ownership of about $12,337.32. And if you factor in the $7,000 down payment, it's about $19,337.32. So, assuming everything goes smoothly like it did last year, I can expect to pay, probably another $12,400 or so dollars in this next year, which, would be pretty acceptable, I think. But I mean, that totally depends on your situation and if you think that is a fair cost. Because keep in mind, these costs are subjective, right? I mean, what I find acceptable, you might not find acceptable, and so on. So my state does have vehicle property tax too, so that's another cost to consider. And it's pretty expensive. I think for this particular car, it would be almost $1,300 a year. So, that's just another thing to consider, and you would have to factor that into your total cost. If if you live in a state that does have vehicle property tax. All things considered, do I think this price is worth it? Yeah, I mean, as I said, I think it's pretty acceptable for me personally. But, that totally depends on your situation and if you think that's acceptable. Keep in mind, if you do need to have some serious maintenance done on a car like this, it can be pretty pricey. For example, getting the brakes done, I've heard from people who own these cars, it can be like $4,000 plus. I've been very lucky to not have to have that done yet, but again, I don't drive the car that much either. I mean, in like the 14 months I've owned it, I've put maybe 10,000 miles on it. So of course, keep that in mind. And if you are going to buy one of these used, make sure it has a decent amount of mileage on it and you're able to get a service history so you know how often it's been in the shop. You know if the car is, reliable. Just some amount of mileage to the point where it gives you a pretty clear picture of the history of the vehicle. I feel like that really might help save you headaches down the line. And when you buy these cars and they're at like the bottom of their depreciation, I feel like they're a purchase that, starts to make a little bit of sense. I mean, you take a look at the car market in the past year, and I'm not saying it's going to stay like that forever. I expect it to kind of burst sometime soon. But I mean, in the year I've owned my car, it's actually increased in value. So, I mean, that's everything I have to say on this subject. I hope you might have learned something today and you came out of this video realizing that, if you have a good one, these cars are not incredibly expensive to own and they can actually be pretty reasonable. As always, thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.